to me divine inspiration until peace returns to every nation. Until peace returns to every nation. When you move in me, all I see is the perfect art in your plan. When you move in me, all I'll be is in the perfect heart of a man. You're the perfect heart of a man. You're the perfect heart of every man.
Beautiful. Thanks, Rick. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Happy Sunday to you. It's always a treat to have an opportunity to learn a few things and then to share a few things as I go along. We've been working on a series of lessons based on this very powerful book called The Bond. It's by Lynn McTaggart and the author of The Intention Experiment. How many of you are familiar with The Intention Experiment? I'm going to move over here. Charles, can we go ahead and kill the projector for now, or blanket? Thank you. Trying to get centered here. You know what I always say, never centered, always returning to center. So we've been working on this wonderful work called The Bond, connecting through the space between us. And we talked about the understanding that research and science is actually showing that one of our most prevalent, one of our most powerful, one of our most dynamic motivators in life actually is a movement to more to cooperate than it is to compete. Now, it's oftentimes difficult to see that in our society and our culture, but it is actually been shown out through numerous experiments that ultimately the whole idea of the survival of the fittest that was presented by Darwin actually demonstrates that those that are fittest are those that learn to cooperate. Those are the ones that really survive. In nature and humanity, it really is those who actually are able to work together in a positive way that really begins to shift and change society and culture in more permanent and more obviously ongoing and positive ways. And our lesson this week is about the title of it is called The Unifying Effect of Fairness. And I thought about that, and it's a really interesting thing to consider and to contemplate. And I was thinking about this idea of fairness and what it means to be fair. And I came across a story about a charming story about Thomas Wheeler, who was the CEO of the Massachusetts Mutual Life Insurance Company, big executive. And he tells this story on himself, and he says he and his wife were driving along an interstate highway when he noticed that their car was low on gas, and so he basically pulled off the highway and pulled into just this rundown gas station with just one gas pump. And he asked the attendant to fill it up, and he decided to kind of walk around a little bit while the attendant was filling it up. And then when he came back, he noticed that his wife and the attendant were in a really lively discussion about something. And then as he came up, he paid, and the attendant kind of went on. And the wife said, "Well, bye, good to see you." And he was kind of curious about that. He got in the car, and he said, "Well, you know, boy," he said, what was the conversation about? He says, well, you know, it just happens that guy was actually someone I went to high school with. In fact, we dated for well over a year, you know. And he said, wow, boy, I sure was lucky that I came along, because otherwise you'd have been married to a gas station attendant. And she said, well, dear, no. If you hadn't come along, he'd have been the CEO and you'd have been the gas station attendant. I think there's some real truth in this story oftentimes, so I want to acknowledge that. Another story I came across I really like, and there was a small town baker who bought his butter from a local farmer. And after weighing the butter, he concluded that the farmer had been reducing the amount in the packages of butter but was charging the same rate. And he basically accused him of fraud and took him to court and was before the judge. And the judge asked the farmer, do you have a measure for your weights? And the farmer said, well, yes, sir. You see, when I began buying the butter from the farmer, when the baker started buying butter from me, I kind of felt like I needed to buy his bread also. And so what I used for weights was 1 pound of his bread. So if he's not getting as much butter, it's his own fault. See, fairness, interestingly enough, whether we realize it or not, whether we understand it or not, fairness actually is something that is built into us. That's one of the things that she's talking about in our work here. The chapter title is called Taking Turns, and she had an interesting experiment that she reported on. And let me see if I can encapsulate this experiment. One of the researchers built a computer program, and the computer program basically played games against itself, or it played games against, basically she set up in the computer two contestants within the computer. And they were basically, were given the instructions to use the best strategy to be able to win. And to use the best strategy to be able to win. And so she had them playing a particular game called the Prisoner's Dilemma. And the Prisoner's Dilemma is this particular game, she says, was the perfect vehicle for studying the nature of cooperation because it revolved around the question of working together versus working alone. And should the two criminals cooperate or sell each other out? And if you're trying to win with the highest score, why would you cooperate, which would likely mean a lower score? So the prisoner's dilemma is kind of like this. There's kind of 4 scenarios. The two prisoners are basically told that if they will rat out the other prisoner, then they'll get a lighter sentence. And so the prisoners have an option here. Neither one of them talks, in which case they both are treated equally, treated the same. They still have consequences. One of them talks and rats out the other one, in which case one gets a lighter sentence, the other one gets a heavier sentence. Or both of them talk, and the reality is they both wind up getting the same penalty, either way. And so it's kind of one of those interesting scenarios with, do you make a decision for your own self, or do you make a decision for a cooperative experience, you might say? And so she worked with this, and then she worked with another computerized program, a game that was called Tit for Tat. And the way you work with the prisoner's dilemma is one cooperates, the other one cooperates, vice versa, back and forth. And if one doesn't cooperate, the other one doesn't cooperate. So you basically match whatever the other one's doing. Well, what she discovered really is fascinating. What she discovered is that after a while, she programmed these computer games to run thousands of games, to be able to do that, because computers can do these things, play these games so quickly. But what she discovered was that over a period of time, and she hadn't programmed any kind of ethical decisions, any kind of anything like that, but what she discovered over a period of time is the two parties in that computer game, both computer programs recognize, it means basically the same programs, they began taking turns. They began taking turns. And she replicated this over and over again. And what she programmed in is what is the best strategy for winning. And what she found was it always wound back to this strategy, taking turns. Isn't that fascinating? She gives numerous other examples of research that shows that the acts of taking turns or the acts of fairness ultimately are those which actually transcend and really do ultimately win out. They're the ones that actually make a difference in a way that really works for the highest good for everyone concerned. See, fairness burns deep within the hearts of each and every one of us. Neuroscientists have discovered that there is actually a trigger within our human brain that basically says it's not fair. And interestingly enough, that gets triggered whether we are on the side of being advantaged or whether we're being on the side of being disadvantaged. Either way, there's something that gets triggered within us as humans that basically says it's not fair. Now, don't get me wrong. There are also others, and there's triggers within us that basically say, it's fair for me, so therefore it's fair. And this is one of the challenges that we face actually in our world, is there's also the egotistical understanding and viewpoint that says what's fair for me is fair. It ultimately is not fair, of course, and there's a belief system that says that it is, and there's a mechanism in us that basically sometimes will override this underlying basic awareness of the need and the ability to be fair. She says that people in most societies, including indigenous populations and citizens of all political persuasions, have ideas about fairness that are surprisingly identical. So she goes on to say, in our hearts, we know ultimately what is fair. We know what is fair in our hearts. And if we listen to that, we have a tendency to act in that way. But we also have a tendency to not listen to our hearts a lot of times. Isn't that true? And so the extent to which any local, national community begins to fray relates to a deterioration of fairness, basic reciprocity. Reciprocity, basically a giving and a taking, a receiving. It's taking turns. It's about being balanced. And any culture that doesn't really create that and really sustain that is really challenged to even continue to stay as a culture. Isn't it true? So, nevertheless, fairness is a practice that promotes unity within communities. So, the more we're able to work toward a system and a way of being in our connections and our relationships with an idea toward this feeling and this sense of what is fair, the more we're able to stay in connection and community with each other. Studies show that any society and a culture that of taking turn, when it falls apart, when taking turns falls apart, then it requires really, interestingly enough, it only requires a small group of individuals that are committed to this idea of fairness to begin to make a shift, however, which is really powerful. She quotes the Stanford experiment, and actually there's another, there was a TV series, I understand, that was made based upon this idea of the Stanford experiment. Now the Stanford experiment was a very powerful experiment, and basically, it was set up at Stanford University by a professor there, and they took some of the students and made them as guards, and they took some of the students and made them as prisoners. And as they began to work through this kind of role play of some being guards and some being prisoners, what they discovered is eventually the prisoners became very submissive and but the guards became absolutely brutal. And these students began to really become very brutal to each other. I mean, these are guys who went to class together, they knew each other, and yet there was something about being in those positions, in those roles, that actually triggered something within them, and many of them they had to actually end the experiment because it really began, someone from the outside had to come in and actually point out to the professor who was so engrossed in the study and so got so caught up in it and the rightness of what was going on, someone from the outside had to come in and say, wait a minute, look what's going on here. And he woke up and had to end the experiment because they were actually being really significantly brutal to the prisoners. Well, it's really fascinating because some years later that study was replicated. And what they found was, in this second study, the prisoners actually began to organize. And they actually began to unify, and they began to collectively work together. And in the very act of doing that, they actually disrupted the whole experiment, the whole system, and basically they were actually able to maintain their sense of well-being. They were able to maintain a sense of, even though, interestingly enough, the guards actually still began to become very brutal and even at times violent toward them. When they stuck together, this group fared actually much better. But they discovered they had to still end the experiment. Now, one of the things that she says is that they've shown different experiments over and over again how when a group is being challenged, dominated, if they will actually stay together, they actually become stronger than the ones that are dominating. Isn't that interesting? So there's a powerful understanding that when we collectively come together, we can overcome even those things that are challenging. Now, these appear to be things that are going on outside here in the world, and they are. But I think it's really valuable for us to understand that all of these things also, there are things that go on inside of us. It's important for us to recognize that we have a place within us where we understand and recognize this innate sense of fairness, both about ourselves and with also some of those voices inside of us you might call the prison guards, you know. You remember those? You know what I'm talking about? If we allow the prison guards in our head to continue to run amok, then they will actually beat us down, but they don't really work if you actually listen to the voices within you that are lifting you up, and you pay attention to those and you work in that direction. Fairness is basically, according to neuroscientists, it's actually hardwired within us. And there is that spot within us that says it's not fair. And so we actually will do things, people will do things, culture will do things to actually bring about a sense of fairness. And one of the things that she points out is that some of the research points out that it appears to be fairly universal, that there really is universally this sense of fairness throughout different cultures. Now, don't get me wrong, different cultures have different definitions of what that means and different ways of understanding it. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have a sense of fairness. She says that although we may be polarized in many areas in our hearts, all of us, it doesn't matter rich or poor, it doesn't matter which party we're involved in, there is a sense that there is fairness in life. And people ultimately do know when they're in that place of fairness and when they are not. Now, they can make choices still. One of the challenges that we have out here in the world is the challenge with this idea of fairness really is how we see our connection. See, here's the thing. There are people in their cultures who very much feel that what is fair for them and their family. That's what's fair. And then there are those who believe that what is fair for them and their tribe. And for them, that's what's fair. And then there are those who believe that what is fair for them and their city. And that's what's fair for them. And then there are those who believe that what is what's fair for them and their county or state. If it's fair for my state, then it's got to be fair, right? Some who actually say that what is fair for my country. And that's what's fair. But when we really understand the essence of fairness, what we recognize is the larger the circle that we make, the more we are participating in what is fair. And the moment that we narrow that idea of fairness down to me and mine, we've automatically stepped out of an energy and a sense of fairness. Unfortunately, it's a challenge in us psychologically, emotionally, mentally, because our culture and so much of our life is geared toward what's fair for me and mine. And if we're not really paying attention to and looking at a larger picture, drawing a larger circle, as they say, then we're ultimately going to find ourselves in a place where we're experiencing a sense of unfairness. And it may be whether it's we're up here and someone else is down there, or we're down here and someone else is up there. And there's an innate movement, there's an innate response, it seems, for all of us to try to move back into this place of fairness. And sometimes that's done in a way that's violent. Sometimes it's done in a way that's violent. Interestingly enough, ultimately, a violent response to a sense of unfairness only creates more unfairness. When we try to use power and force to try to make things fair, what we really wind up doing is basically creating a different kind of unfairness. Isn't that true? And so ultimately, trying to get the world, others, life out here to be fair, it's not a winning game. See, fairness is not a sameness, but it's an equal opportunity, an equal say in areas that affect our society, equal rewards and contribution in life, and rewards that don't come at someone else's expense. It's about honoring that connection that we all have and recognizing that whenever I do it to someone else, I'm not really doing it to someone else. Jesus said, "Inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me." See, there's a powerful principle in this understanding. And that powerful principle is recognizing whatever we do to others in the world, however we act, however we treat others in life, however we treat others in our world, we're actually doing it to that oneness of who and what we are. We're doing it to ourselves. We're basically doing it to ourselves. So let's talk a little bit about ways of looking beyond this. You see, one of the things that she points out here is that when we are in a place where we are open to the possibilities of truly being fair with ourselves and fair with each other. See, interesting, you can't be fair with another person and not be fair with yourself, can you? Ultimately, you can't. Because if you're not being fair with yourself, you're going to find yourself in a place where you're feeling like this isn't fair. Isn't it true? And you can't be fair with yourself and exclude being fair with others. Because ultimately, there's going to be a disparity there. And so it's not about necessarily being the same, but it is really about honoring both, honoring the place within us where we are connected and where we are open to experiencing the possibilities of a greater good. With all our current crises in our world, one of the most valuable things that you and I can do is really begin to practice and work with ideas and the experience and to reestablish an awareness and a sense of fairness. It's actually crucial for our culture, for our lives, for society. So the good news is it doesn't take everybody to understand and to experience that sense of fairness for change to begin to be made. Charles Fillmore in Mysteries of Genesis says, "Those who have a living faith in God's all-sufficiency do not beg or accept things without recompense, but give value received for everything." He's talking about an understanding that when you really begin to recognize, you see, ultimately, whenever there is a discrepancy, an unfairness, it really comes from a sense of greed and covetousness. Wouldn't you agree? There's a belief system that says, well, there's not enough, so I'm going to get mine. And that actually has been prevalent throughout our society and culture. It's based primarily on the teachings of Thomas Malthus. Some of you may be familiar with Malthusian theory, which says that the population of the world is growing such that there's not enough resources for everybody. And it seems like that makes sense, doesn't it? And from an outer perception, that's what we think is the reality. But Thomas Malthus didn't really get or understand the unlimited supply of spirit, and that you and I are in the process of creating resources even as we are sitting right here in this space. Do you realize that? There really is only one presence and one power, and it is the source of all good, and there is a power that allows us to move into an understanding that ultimately there's an unlimited supply of good. Now, don't get me wrong. We have manifested in many ways limitations in certain supplies in life. You know, how many of you remember that we had this amazing oil crisis a while back where we were running out of oil? Do you remember that? What's going on right now? It's getting close to $1. Because all of a sudden, not only do we have not enough oil, but see, what has been discovered is that oil is not the only form of energy. Now, the oil industry is not happy about that, because they want us all to believe that oil and gas are the only way that we can survive in this world. It's the only form of energy that's viable. But one of the things that's going on in our world, in our culture, is, in all honesty, alternative forms of energy are being developed, and they're becoming economical, and they are actually competing now, beginning to compete at least on some level. So this is one of the factors and one of the reasons why we have dollar oil today. Now, the oil industry says, oh, no, that stuff is not practical, it'll never work, you know. Sorry, it's already working. And we are beginning to make a shift. It may not seem like it, but that's one of the reasons why we have dollar oil now, or $1.20 something now, $1.40. I haven't filled up lately. It's been so cheap I haven't had to, which is great. But the idea, the understanding is to recognize that, yes, there may be a particular form that has limits and limitations, but the supply of energy is unlimited. The supply of energy is unlimited. We just have to open ourselves up to the different possibilities of ways that we can tap into that. But the unfairness comes when we believe that oil is the only way that we can have our good. Now, we have a tendency to do this with lots of other things in our lives, don't we? We have a tendency to think that unless we have love from a particular individual in a certain way, that we don't have any love. It's just as silly as thinking that the only way to get, energy is through oil. Maybe even more silly, perhaps. Love is an amazing and universal force and power and energy and substance that is unlimited beyond measure. And we all have it, and we all have the ability to share it and receive it. And if we are in the flow of that understanding, then we are participating in a way that is balanced and fair because we are both receiving and giving of it. We have a tendency to wait for someone else to give it to us before we think we have it. It's true, isn't it? Confessions, come on. As my friend Gary Simmons says, it's a hairball, just spit it up. We think we have to get somebody to love us in order to feel loved, in order to be loved. But we have it backwards. Reality is we have to give love in order to give and to receive love. Now, it's important to understand, we may or may not ever get it back from who we share it with. But that's the power and importance of a universal understanding of fairness. You see, if we look to the world to be fair to us, to try to get the world to be fair to us, we're actually struggling with the effects of a belief system of unfairness. Isn't that right? And if we're struggling with the effects of a belief system of unfairness, we're actually helping to participate in creating even more experiences of unfairness. But when we begin to look within and understand that ultimately we live in a universe that is based upon a principle of fairness. It's based upon a principle of divine order. You guys know that term? You ever heard of that term? It's one of the things we talk about in unity, and understanding that ultimately everything works out in a way that is harmonious and balanced and fair. It doesn't necessarily mean that someone out there is going to recognize that or reciprocate in that way. But that's irrelevant, because ultimately, if we get caught up in the struggle to try and make them be fair, we're actually contributing more to the experience of unfairness, both theirs and our own. And so what I encourage you to do is to really begin to look at how much am I trying to get others' life, the world, to fit into my mold of what is fair. And am I willing to take a look at, and as Gandhi says, be the change that we wish to see in the world? Richard and Mary Alice Jaffola wrote a wonderful book called Unity, A Quest for Truth. And on the human level of appearance, they say, it seems that changes can lead to loss and injustice. But beyond the appearance is a level of experience where God's law of adjustment is always active, turning losses into gains, revealing the truth that even if you intended it for evil, God will work for good. Powerful. In the Revealing Word, Charles Fillmore says, the law of compensation is universal and not subject to personal demands. If the mind is turned toward man as one's recompense or fairness, it is turned away from divine law, which is the essence of fairness. So we're created in the image and after the likeness of that which is creating always. And so when we participate in an idea, a thought, a belief system that says it's not fair, perhaps we're helping to set up even more unfairness. However, it doesn't mean that we don't take steps and actions. See, one of the first steps that we have to take, though, is to recognize where true fairness lies. Ultimately, true fairness doesn't lie in our political system. We know about that already, don't we? It ultimately doesn't lie in our spouse. It doesn't lie in our partner. It really lies in an understanding of an alignment with that force and energy that is always in the process of bringing about balance and harmony in ourselves and in our lives. Charles Fillmore also says that prejudice and bigotry often blind us to real merit. There is in everyone that spirit of fairness which will give every idea a chance to prove itself. It is this counsel or this work be of men, it will be overthrown. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. This is in Acts 5, 38, 39. So it's a conclusion of every well-balanced mind that we should listen to every doctrine with this kind of good judgment in front. And in another place he goes on to say, so long as the idea of covetousness is lodged in the human mind as its dominant generating factor, there can be no successful community life. The idea must be eliminated from the mental plane first, and the next step, the outer practice, will then be safe and successful. And so in order to really overcome what seems to be the unfairness in our world, we have to begin to shift our awareness to an understanding that ultimately we live in and of the presence of that which is always in the process of bringing about a greater good. We're in that process, and we can be participants in that in a conscious way by holding an energy and an understanding and a trust, one in the unlimited supply of good, the unlimited supply of well-being, the unlimited supply, if you want to call it, grace, the unlimited supply of love, the unlimited supply of order, of harmony, of balance. And to align ourselves more in that understanding and then make our decisions coming from an awareness that whatever we are doing out here in the world needs to reflect that sense and that knowing. And we practice that understanding by recognizing that whatever we do unto the least of these, now the least, that seems like it's kind of a term of an up or down, but I'm going to suggest to you, even those who don't really get this understanding, it's our work not to try and get them to get this understanding. It's our work to try and live this understanding even with those who don't get it. Wow. Because the reality is what we're putting our energy into is what we're helping to create. Right? This week, Bill shared something with us this week I thought was really in our men's group. I don't think he'll mind me sharing it, but he was talking about his grandkids. And he was really interested in and aware of how different the parenting style of his kids are than what he grew up with, right? And one of the things he noticed was that whenever the grandkids were trying to do something and they didn't want them to do it, they didn't stand there and say no. They basically turned them in a different direction and pointed them in a way, why don't you go over here and do this? And so it wasn't a resistance or a sharp reprimand about no, thou shalt not kind of thing, because you know how we respond to that. You know, we all don't care much for the thou shalt nots, do we? It's true. But instead, gave them something to focus toward. And so the more we put our energy toward focusing on an experience, an expression, and a practice of fairness with ourselves and with each other and in our lives and our world, the more we're helping to create that as a possibility in our culture, in our life, in our world. So homework for this week. Simply ask yourself the question, am I being fair? Or am I looking for someone else to be fair to me? You know, it's just an exercise. Have fun with it or don't at all. It's always a choice, right? All right, let's move into our meditation time. So let's take a nice deep breath. Gently breathe in and breathe out. And breathe in and breathe out. Now in your heart and mind, ask yourself the question, which is more important, breathing in or breathing out? And if you think it's breathing in, just breathe in for a while and don't breathe out. And if you think it's breathing out, just breathe out and don't breathe in. And just notice how it is absolutely a part of your nature to balance, to bring fairness, to recognize the importance, the significance of taking turns, of allowing, of giving and receiving, of blessing and being blessed, of loving and receiving love. You see, you and I are created in the image and after the likeness of that which is always breathing us in and breathing us out. And just let a feeling of safety and security and well-being and comfort come into your awareness. And be open for the allowing of that divine order to guide and direct, to inspire, to uplift, and to bring harmony and balance in all aspects of your life. And as such, allowing you to be an instrument of that fairness. Thank you, Blessed Spirit, for the alignment of heart and mind. And so it is. Take another nice deep breath, and when you're ready, gently open your eyes.